It's time for the man who taught Vince Carter how to slam.
You can't make this tough up.
The man whose three inspired the Curry family.
Pulls it up for three.
I don't exaggerate, I congratulate.
With another masterpiece.
It's time for You Know Who, my man Sekou.
Goes airborne.
It's Sekou Smith's Hang Time Podcast. Take it away.
Welcome into another edition of the Hang Time Podcast. I'm your host, Sekou Smith, here in Atlanta. First show of 2020, by the way, the Hang Time Podcast, surviving into a new decade. How about that? We got a great show lined up for you. We're going to break things down, all things Atlanta Hawks, with Sarah K. Spencer of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, brand new beat writer, giving us all of the goods on the Hawks. And also a visit with our old friend, former co-host John Schuhmann, the stat master himself from NBA.com. Talk to him a little bit about the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Brooklyn Nets, what he saw at that game on Tuesday night, and what the outlook is now for a Thunder team that's shocked us, really, and for a Nets team that's really going backwards. They're struggling. No Kyrie Irving, no Kevin Durant, what they might be for the remainder of this season. So appreciate you diving in and rocking with us into this next decade. Check these interviews out here with Sarah K. Spencer and John Schuhmann. Sarah Spencer, glad you could join us finally here on the Hang Time Podcast. We're veterans of the same war, covering Hawks teams that struggle for victories.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. First and foremost, what's been, I know when I was covering a 13-win Hawks team, the biggest struggle for me was coming up with creative ways to say the same thing night after night, to describe how a team could lose like that over and over again. What's been your challenge or your biggest challenge so far covering this team and trying to figure out how to frame the season they're having?
I think the hardest part for me, and obviously I'm new to covering the Hawks. I'm originally from Georgia, but I moved back a couple months ago, so I've only been covering the team about 4 months or so now. But I think the hardest part has been, honestly, there's been a lot of injury news. And I think, so on one hand, it's keeping up with, the injuries that they've had, which I know obviously they're not happy about either. But also just, I think it's been hard because obviously Trey, outside of 2 ankle sprains, has been pretty consistent and is pretty much, having an all-star season, at least offensively. But then, so probably the second best player on the team right now, or, a guy that the Hawks were counting on a lot entering the season, John Collins, was obviously out for 25 games with a suspension. And then Kevin Huerter was out for 11 games with that shoulder injury. And even when he was playing, for the first, kind of hefty portion of the season, he really didn't look like himself at all because he was having a lot of issues with his right knee. So there you have, the Hawks trio that they were counting on coming into this season. They were hoping to build off last season. And they just really haven't been able to, at least not yet, because those 3 guys have only played 83 minutes together total this season. So I think for me, just being new to the team, you kind of plan on, and things happen, and they're not happy about it either, but you kind of plan on okay, this is how this is going to go. These are the guys that I'm going to write about. These are the, working relationships I need to develop. This is what's going to happen. This is this person's role. This is this person's role. And then everything kind of got flipped on its head this year. And the Hawks have a lot of issues and a lot of reasons why they're not winning. But I think having those 3 guys not together, having those 3 guys pretty much, separate until very recently, has been a big problem for them. And it's also been, as a writer, it's kind of been okay, I feel like I'm writing a lot about injuries. I'm writing a lot about who they don't have, as opposed to who they do have because they've just been struggling. So I think it's just kind of trying to find that balance of okay, I've got to find a different angle. I've got to be creative. I've got to write about this in a different way than I have before. But, you know, it's tough because they do have a lot of the same kind of consistent issues. But overall, honestly, I'm really enjoying my first season covering the team. Everyone's been great, and it's been a really good experience, you know, for me so far. Like, I've been traveling a lot, adjusting to that. So it's been a great experience. You know, they're just really struggling on the court right now.
Right. Do you feel like Trey's season, and I know when guys who are playing at an all-star level are on bad teams, what they do tends to feel like empty calories. Like Trey makes the highlights, you know, he makes the top 10s every night. He's going off and scoring like crazy, having these big games, but it almost feels like he's just kind of doing it in the wind. It's not resonating with people maybe just how good a player he is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. And I think that I think more than anything, not to put words in his mouth, but I've talked to him, you know, a handful of times about how, you know, what are the emotions like when you're having the kind of season that you're having and the team is losing, you know? And there are a lot of different arguments and I guess different schools of thought about, you know, are you kind of, you know, is that kind of not a waste, but, you know, is that kind of fruitless when it's not leading to wins? You know, and people have different opinions on that because obviously the Hawks aren't good right now. You know, they continue to lose despite his just like heroics on offense. But I kind of look at it as, what is he supposed to do? You know, I mean, he's not the whole team. He's just himself. And he's going to continue to be himself and play, you know, like an all-star, particularly on, you know, especially on offense. So, you know, whether it leads to wins or not, I'm not quite, you know, again, he's not the whole team. He's only one person. He's not the GM. He's not, he didn't put together this roster. All he can do is the best that he can do. And, you know, but I mean, I do think I've talked to him a lot about how, you know, it is frustrating when you're doing everything that you can and the team still can't pull out wins. But I think he also, you know, as kind of the face of the franchise, that he's challenges himself and he's like, well, clearly I'm not doing enough then, you know, so I think he kind of puts that on his shoulders a lot. Like, you know, okay, down the stretch, I should have done this. I should have done this. But I mean, he continues to, like you said, he continues to make top 10. He continues to have these like crazy highlight reel plays. And so, you know, I think he's just doing the best he can right now and just trying to play to the best of his ability. And obviously it's paying off at least on that individual level. And that's, you know, how much more can you do? You know, he's even, you know, he's never going to be that elite defender with his size. But I think he has picked it up on defense lately. And some of that might just be, you know, I mean, I think some of it is just playing with, like, having some continuity of getting John Collins back, getting Kevin Huerter the way that he, you know, playing the way he has lately, which Kevin's having, he's been on a really, really torrid pace these last 4 games. But, yeah, I think Trey's doing, you know, for the most part, all he can right now.
Yeah. I think about who, you know, wears this losing the most, like who takes it and digests it the most. And Trey, I'm sure it's difficult for him, obviously. But Lloyd Pierce, who I think is a really good young coach and a really honest, in an arena where honesty isn't always the main thing for coaches in the NBA. Lloyd is like brutally honest, which is refreshing. And I'm wondering, how much do you think the struggles that they're having is taking a toll on him? Because I don't want to see him get beat down by losing. This really institutional. It's not about him and what he's teaching right now. They don't have the type of team that's built to win at a high level right now. And you have to know that and understand that as a coach. Do you think he's internalizing some of this losing, or is he keeping it in the right perspective?
I think as far as what he shared publicly, because you're right. I mean, he didn't put together the roster. He's not in charge of the payroll, and I think sometimes those lines can be blurred by people. I think it's hard when a team's losing and it's really frustrating. I think it's hard. People kind of scramble like, okay, where do I assign blame? Because people are frustrated and justifiably so. I think with Lloyd, he was pretty transparent even, and again, I'm new. So one of the first Hawks things I covered was, media day. Like I kind of moved here and then a couple weeks later hopped over to media day, and people were asking him a lot about expectations because the Hawks got a lot of, for one reason or another, the Hawks got a lot of buzz as far as like, oh, is this the year they can creep up and grab the 8 seed? Can they build off last year's finish? How much can they build off last year's finish? Will they take that leap? Will they take baby steps? What will they do? And Lloyd was pretty consistent in his kind of public statements and messaging that any pressure that's put on this team is not going to come from me. And this was before, obviously way before John Collins got suspended, which really threw this team off. They were not at their best. They are not at their best if they don't have John Collins. And so this is way before that. So, him knowing what he knew at the time, he said, any pressure that comes from, outside pressure, whatever, social media, it's not going to come from me because we're not there yet. We're not there yet to where I'm going to put those expectations on this team. So I think he kind of knew coming. I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my impression was that it seemed like he knew, they were still rebuilding. But this team did get a lot of kind of buzz beforehand, which I'm sure kind of adds to the disappointment when they're underperforming or when they only have 8 wins. I think for him, I think he knows, how young this team is. And I think he is really focused on just developing the young guys that they know they're going to have, or at least that the messaging has been pretty consistent that these are the guys we're going to build around. And so I think for him, he's just really, you hear him say the word all the time. He says progression. And I think he's really focused on that. So I think his focus is how can I maximize these young guys? How can I teach them? How can I get them to use their voice more on defense when this is a really young, really quiet team? Again, particularly when John was out. He's a very loud, very boisterous, very outgoing guy, and they didn't have that personality, for 25 games. So I think for him, his thing is just like, how do I get the most out of these guys? He's a defensive coach, so I'm sure it is really frustrating, or a defensive-minded coach at least. I'm sure it's frustrating that this team struggles so much on defense. So I think he's just trying to focus as much on getting these guys developed, as he can.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation for anybody to be in. You mentioned that you're from Georgia. That's interesting. I'm curious if you could maybe share a little bit about your background. And then my question is, what was your perspective or your perception of the Hawks growing up? And has it changed at all now that you've seen them in this light professionally as a beat writer that's covering the team every day?
Right. Yeah, so I'm originally from Fayetteville, Georgia, born and raised down here. Graduated from UGA in 2016. Ended up getting a MLB.com internship covering the Pirates, which brought me up to Pittsburgh. And then had a great experience with that. And then I ended up getting a job eventually with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And I was there for a couple years. And right as I was leaving, I was covering Penn State football. And then I got this offer to come cover the Hawks. And it just really seemed like it was just a great opportunity. I was really excited to come back to Georgia, really excited to do some professional sports, kind of transition to doing pro sports. But honestly, growing up, it's kind of been a cool experience covering the NBA because growing up, I was definitely more of a college sports person. I was really into college football. I was really into I became more into college basketball. And then so it's kind of been interesting, because obviously I knew about the Hawks. I mean, I knew, that 60-win season. I mean, I knew about the Hawks. I had heard about them, and I followed them a little bit, but not as much as you'd probably think I did, getting this job. But that's almost kind of been nice because, in this field, like, it's kind of nice to have a little bit of distance from the team you're covering as far as, you don't want to be a fan of that team. You want to have that distance. You want to have that professionalism. Like, I get asked all the time, like, oh, like, the Hawks lost, like, sorry about it. And I'm just like, well, it's not it's not, like, I don't play for the team, so it's nice to have that distance, kind of emotionally and just be able to see everything with that objectivity. So when they lose, I can just be honest and say, this is why they lost. And when they win and I give them credit, that it's unbiased. So yeah, I mean, I had heard a lot about, back when they were good. And then, obviously you hear, okay, now it's time to super duper rebuild. So I had been following that. And then, when I got this job, I was able to really dive in.
Yes. I used to take a lot of grief from people when I first started covering the Hawks in 2005. I covered the Pacers before that. So I'd been around the league, and people, like even local media people here, I was covering a team and they were talking to me like I was a part of the team. And I'm like, it's just my job. Like, I don't root for them. I'm not a part of the organization. Like, why would you assume that I have some emotional connection to that team I'm covering? Which is weird because you're dealing with fans all the time who definitely have a very vibrant emotional connection with the team. And I think sometimes they expect you to have the same thing when you cover them, when it's a much more clinical process for us as professional journalists. You're looking at the team with from a different viewpoint than a fan might. And I don't know if they understand that. And it's much more difficult now in the social media age. I can only imagine what kind of interactions you've had with Hawks Twitter, as I like to call them. They're a very interesting group.
Right.
that do not shy away from sharing their opinions about the team and about you and about what you've done. So I hope they're treating you with a little respect. At least. Oh,
no. Yeah, absolutely. My experience since moving back has been really good. I think the biggest thing that I focus on is just trying to be like, it's important to not have that bias, because it allows you to do what you do a lot better because you're able to kind of not see things through those rose-colored glasses, so to speak. But no, you're definitely right, and you raise a good point that social media has made that a lot harder. Like, you get a lot of times on Twitter, people will say, we lost tonight, or fans will be like, we need to do this, we need to do that, and it's just like, I have to be like, well, it's not, I'm not in charge of payroll. Like, this isn't my money. Like, it's not this is not my W-2, like I write for the AJC covering the Hawks, but I think there is a lot of confusion sometimes whenever I'm like, oh, I cover the Hawks. People will be like, oh, so you work for the Hawks. And it's like, that's not what I'm trying to say. So I don't know, maybe I need to get better at explaining that. But yeah, social media has definitely blurred those lines a lot.
Well, look, I'll take the arrows for you. I still have Hawks fans yelling at me about stuff and I hadn't covered the team for years, but it's interesting. I'm enjoying your stuff, and I think fans will as well. It's good to, a fresh set of eyeballs on the team as well is often, at least in my experience, that's often been a way to get a much different perspective and a much different look at a team that you've been watching for a long time when somebody else comes in just with fresh ideas and a fresh outlook on it. So very impressed, like I said, with your work and continue. Good luck. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you again here on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good insight there from Sarah Spencer. Check out her work at ajc.com. And from Sarah, we go now to John Schuhmann. Get a little bit of insight from John on the Brooklyn Nets and certainly the team that vanquished them Tuesday night. The Oklahoma City Thunder, one of the more surprising teams in the league, and how Chris Paul and those guys are doing what they're doing. John Schuhmann, Happy New Year. Glad to get you back on the podcast here to pick your brain. I know power rankings are out, but I'm going to skip a deep dive into your power rankings to ask you what you thought of the Oklahoma City Thunder, one of the hottest teams in the league right now. If I'm not mistaken, they're the best team in the West since sometime in December. I forget the exact date, but how in the hell is this happening?
I mean, you can go back to Thanksgiving. They're 15-5 since Thanksgiving, which is the second best record in the league. Only Milwaukee has been better. What's crazy is they have the second best record in the league, but if you look at their point differential over that time, it's only the seventh best, and it's because they're winning a lot of close games. No team has played more, games within 5 in the last 5 than the Thunder this season. They've played 28 games that were within 5 of their last 5 of their. So there's 37 games total. 28 have been within 5 points in the last 5 minutes. No team, the other teams played more than 24 of those games. They started 4-8, and since late November, they're 13-3 in those close games, which is probably unsustainable, but still very good. And you can obviously credit, a veteran like Chris Paul for a lot of that success. It's also with their late games is when they go to their 3-guard lineup, which has been really, really good. And so they have 3 guys who can get buckets down the stretch of close games, and I think that's just been huge for them. And then Tuesday night in Brooklyn, it was just sort of a continuation of what they've been doing and a continuation of the Nets' struggles, especially on the offensive end of the floor.
Yeah. Is this vindication for CP3? I know a lot of people thought, even if he went to Oklahoma City, he'd be a short timer, or he wouldn't be as happy about being in that situation as some guys would, and maybe wouldn't perform at the level that honestly he's always performed. It hadn't mattered to him what the circumstance. He's been the same guy, which is a credit to him and to his professionalism everywhere he's been.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's definitely taken it in stride. I think he knows the situation with his contract, that trading it is not is a lot easier said than done, and that he's got to sort of play through what he's doing. But I think he's accepted it. I think he's definitely a mentor to a lot of those dudes in that locker room, especially Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Shoot, last night after the game, like he was taking Shai Gilgeous-Alexander out that night or whatever, because the rest of the team was going home, but Chris and Shai were going to stay over in New York because Chris was going to go to the Players Association offices the next day. And so it was, you could tell that there's a mentorship. Like he was talking to his wife on the phone after the game last night, and Shai was there, and like they basically count him as like their third kid, basically. And, so I think he's sort of definitely accepted the role that he's got there, which is mentoring, especially, a young team, but especially this one young guard with a ton of potential to be, one of the best guards in the league someday. And so I think that's, it's a credit to him, as a vet, he definitely, as much as people, as much as he might get under the skin of some people with his antics on the court, I think he's a vet who enjoys being a leader and being a mentor to some of these young guys, and he's playing really well. Like it's not like, that's all he is. He's come down the stretch of these close games. He's winning games for this team. I mean, like Tuesday night, he basically put them on his back. They were down 7 with less than 4 minutes to go, outscored the Nets 12-5 down the stretch, and he had 10 of the 12. Gets to that mid-range spot, and it's money. He's been money in the clutch. He is, he's shooting 56% from mid-range overall, and then with the score within 5 in the last 5 minutes, he's 15 for 21 from mid-range, which is just ridiculous. I highlighted maybe a month ago, there was a game where they're playing the Warriors, and they were up maybe 3 or 5 or something late, and he, got a pick and roll, and the big man dropped back, and he pulled up for like a 12-footer and screened the layup as he was shooting it, and obviously drained it. He knows how to get to those spots. It was interesting last night. The Nets will drop back with their pick and roll coverage, and so down that stretch, he pulled up into a couple comfortable sort of pull-up jumpers where he didn't have to fade away or anything. And then, they brought Jared Allen up a little bit higher to sort of contest those shots, and he just went to his fadeaway, step-back fadeaway and drained a couple more. So it was a clinic last night, and like I said, I think he's just sort of embraced this role and is not only a leader, but also just, this team's best player at times.
How do we grade that trade, Shu, if the Thunder make the playoffs? I mean, given all the assets that Sam Presti got out of the deal, were they to make the playoffs, do we have to regrade it and say, wait a minute, maybe the Thunder didn't, come out as bad as some people thought they did? I know you lose the All-Stars and the MVP candidates for assets. You figure you cash in later, but I mean, if they make the playoffs and get all of that, it's a pretty good job by Sam Presti.
Well, I don't know anybody who really graded them poorly in the first place. They got a ton for Paul George. I mean, we all know that the Clippers were desperate, and so all those picks they got for Paul George was just a ton. And then it's not like Russell Westbrook has a much better contract than Chris Paul, but they got Chris Paul and additional assets in that trade. And it's not like Westbrook is clearly the right answer for Houston either. So it's I don't think, in the first place, I don't think they did poorly. I think they did pretty well. The fascinating thing is, where do they go from here? Are they buyers? Are they sellers? They have a good team. They are comfortably in 7th place in the West. Closer now to 6th place than to 8th place. And they have Chris Paul, Gallinari, and Steven Adams, 3 really good veterans. Obviously any of those they could trade, but if they keep them, they got a good core, and obviously Gilgeous-Alexander has been fantastic, and then Schroeder has been terrific as a 6th man. So, I don't know. I'd be fascinated to see what they do between now and February 6th, and I think they're a dangerous team in the playoffs, even if they just stood pat. And they don't necessarily have to sell off. Gallinari would be the easiest one to sell off, right? Expiring contract. Everybody could use more shooting. But even if they don't, even if they just say, hey, let's just keep him, and if he walks in the summer, he walks, they already have the biggest sort of trove of assets as it is. So it's not like they're in need of adding more picks. There might be diminishing returns on the amount of picks that they have. So I'm really interested to see how they do. They're playing really well. I do think it's a little like I noted, because of so much of their success has been in close games, that it's a little bit unsustainable. They're not as good as that 15-5 record would infer, but they're still really good. I mean, and I think we saw that at the beginning of the season. We just looked at that roster and said, this is a competitive team. We didn't realize that the sort of bottom of the West would fall apart, and that you'd have teams like San Antonio and Portland, and even a team like Minnesota and New Orleans just be so disappointing that the West 8th seed right now is 15-20. But I think we knew that this team was going to be competitive.
Do you think they have an all-star on this roster? Is Chris or Shea maybe?
That's a great question. I think Chris Paul is making a case, and I think he'll definitely get some consideration from coaches. But obviously the West guard spot is crowded. But like if you were picking between, say, Russell Westbrook and Chris Paul right now for an all-star spot, would you not pick Chris Paul?
That's what I'm saying. I mean, what about he and Damian Lillard? I mean, there are going to be a couple guys with better numbers, but their teams won't be playing better.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be fascinating because, like, the East, there's 6 good teams, right? And the West, there's 7 good teams. Like, do you limit your all-star picks to those teams? Maybe not. But I wouldn't consider a team that's terrible. Like, Lillard's, the Blazers are in 10th place, 6 games under 500. They're not terrible, and he's been obviously fantastic offensively. So it's a fascinating question. I'm glad I only have to pick 5 starters, and for my vote. And I don't even stress that much because if there's a close call, I imagine the guy I don't pick is going to get a reserve selection anyway. So, I'm glad that I don't have to make that sort of 11th and 12th guy. I still think they should expand the rosters to 13 all-stars in the first place. But it'll be fun to see sort of how that plays out in both conferences. I think the East, it'll be interesting to see who gets those last 2 spots because I think you sort of run out of all-stars once you get to 9 or 10. And in the West, certain positions are just crowded.
The flip side of this conversation, obviously, is the other team in that you saw last night in Brooklyn. And I don't know what to make of them. We knew they wouldn't have Kevin Durant. I had no idea Kyrie's, season would be in question at this point, whether or not he comes back at all, whether he comes back sooner or later. It seems like whatever opportunity he would have had to establish himself, without Kevin Durant is gone. It's kind of vanished. What do you make of the Nets and where they are right now?
Well, as far as Irving, we've still got more than half of the season left. So I'm not, counting him out. At the same time, I don't think any of us would be surprised if at any point they say he's having surgery and he's done for the season. I think it's just a sort of weird situation where they're trying to get through it and without surgery, where he's trying to get through it without surgery. But it's not responding as well as they'd like. I don't, at this point, I don't think you count him out coming back. At the same time, you could, like I said, he could be done for the season at some point, at any point. Basically, they could, change directions and say, hey, he's done for the season. But obviously, you got to just, with the Nets themselves, they just got to keep going forward, assuming that he's not around. And it's good they got Karis LeVert back. I think he looked pretty good in his limited minutes. He couldn't play. They had him. I thought he played pretty well last night, but then he couldn't play in the overtime because he had reached his minutes limit. And the Nets are a team that does not budge on minutes limits. So that helps, but their offense has just been awful. They're the only winless team since Christmas. They're 0-7 since Christmas with the league's 9th ranked defense over that time. So they have a top 10 defense, and they're 0-7, which tells you how bad their offense has been. As they always have, they take the right shots. They're over that 7 games, they're 4th in field goal attempts in the restricted area per game, but they're 29th in restricted area field goal percentage, and they're 3rd in 3-point attempts per game, and they're 29th in 3-point percentage. So that tells you that their offense is just falling apart over the last, and it started to look pretty bad in a couple of games before Christmas as well, but they sort of held on in those first 10, 15 games without Kyrie Irving. Spencer Dinwiddie was been fantastic. Guys like Taurean Prince and Garrett Temple shot well. But then those two guys went into a huge slump. Dinwiddie hasn't been finishing as well as he was before. He, shot poorly from 3-point range. He hasn't finished as well as he was earlier in the season. And so they're searching for answers, especially on the offensive end. The defense has sort of kept them in games, and then they sort of just can't get buckets down the stretch when they need them. They scored 2 points in overtime last night, so that tells you just how much they're struggling. So I don't know the answer, and they've got some tough games coming up ahead. They have a relatively tough January schedule. They're at home a lot for most of January, but they have a lot of good opponents coming to Brooklyn.
Yeah, sounds like a team that could use what Kyrie Irving brings when he's at his best.
And I think we saw, with the comparison with CP, we saw the limits of Dinwiddie. Like he can get to, he's great at getting to the basket, getting downhill, and even scoring through contact at the basket, but he doesn't have that sort of comfortable pull-up mid-range shot that you need on a handful of possessions down the stretch of close games. And obviously like Chris Paul showed us last night, that he has in his bag. So I think you saw the sort of the limits of their offense just to down the stretch.
This is almost the midpoint of the season, Shu. Last thing I'll ask you is, do you think the playoff race in the East and West right now looks about like what you thought it would? Or is there some glaring surprise? I mean, obviously Miami being as high as they are in the East is probably a shocker to everybody. But outside of that, is it pretty much who you thought we'd have in that mix?
That's a good question. I guess the top six in the East is I'm still surprised by Indiana. Just like I thought, without Oladipo, and also given how many players they lost from their rotation last year, we like the additions of Warren and Brogdon, but they lost a ton of guys that contributed for them last year. They still surprise me, but I guess when you realize that the East sort of gets weak after 6 teams, I guess it's not too much of a surprise that they're in sixth. I guess Brooklyn isn't a surprise without Irving that they haven't been able to stay over 500. And Orlando isn't a surprise that they're there. I think with the teams that are below, none of them. I think some of them I would expect to be closer to 500, like Chicago. I thought Atlanta was going to take a step forward, but obviously haven't. But that's it. And then in the West, I think Dallas is a little bit of surprise. I thought they were sort of a borderline playoff team, right? Like sort of maybe in the 8 to 12 range rather than being top 6. Oklahoma City, I probably would have said in the 8 to 12 range. And then there's just been, like I said before, like San Antonio, disappointment. Portland, disappointment. New Orleans, disappointment. And then Memphis is the big surprise. I mean, that team is 16-22, and a half a game out of 8th place. That's just crazy. Like that team is fascinating just because it's all about the future, but they are competing and they're beating good. They've beat some good teams over the last few weeks. So, and that 8th spot is wide open. It'll be fascinating to see who grabs it. Does any team even approach 500 for the 8th spot in either of these conferences? We'll see. San Antonio, Portland have tough January schedules. So there's an open door for one of these other teams to climb a little bit.
Yeah, should be interesting. Gonna be very curious to see who comes back for some of these teams that, in terms of guys that are out right now that can make an impact. Like I said, I'll be watching Kyrie.
Yeah.
because if he comes back for Brooklyn, maybe that changes their season. And if he doesn't, then we'll have to kind of see what they can do without he and KD this season. So,
yeah, I mean, the rest of the East is just so bad. I mean, I think Chicago is the only one where I would say I think they have a chance of climbing up and taking Brooklyn's spot if Brooklyn continues to slide. Other than that, like, I think the rest of it is just, especially with Blake Griffin being out, maybe, indefinitely. I think Chicago is the only team, just because they've been really good defensively, that can sort of compete for a playoff spot that's, currently out.
Interesting. Well, keep an eye on it. Appreciate your Shoe as always, and people keep following you on Twitter for all of your insights, including your hating on me. I saw you bashing me the other day in my hoop game. I'm retired. I can't believe you go out there and throw me into the bus.
I do like the other Sekou though. I'm on the Sekou Doumbouya bandwagon. Watched him the other day and was very, very intrigued. So I'm kind of glad that he's going to get plenty of opportunities down the stretch of the season to do his thing.
No doubt. The young Padawan is balling. We'll see what happens, man. Appreciate your Shoe as always.
All righty.
Got to say thank you to Sarah K. Spencer of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and our main man, John Schuhmann of NBA.com, for joining us this week on the podcast. We appreciate you listening. Appreciate the feedback as always. We'll see you right here next time on the Hang Time Podcast.
Thanks for listening to Sekou Smith's Hang Time Podcast. Be sure to check out previous episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, NBA.com/hangtime, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, Hoops fans.